If you have watched the previous two videos, you might be wondering exactly how this all came to be. How did the social relations surrounding Zoomers completely invert or disintegrate? How did the system of education fail so totally? I will attempt to begin answering how, and I will offer insight as to why. The social relations of Zoomers are still too young to be considered independent from the generations that raised them. They are still heavily influenced by the authorities that remain in place, what little there is left. This introduces the main point. Most traditional authorities are either nowhere to be found or totally lacking in power. First, let us look at the church. This was the most important foundation in social relations in the West's history. While independent, it ensured that only proper relationships were allowed, and also maintained oversight over the most important relations such as marriage and parenthood. It also provided an explicit moral direction for society based upon repentance and forgiveness. It kept society from sliding into barbarism by ensuring that everyone clung to the law of God even though they could not perfectly keep it. Oftentimes as well, the church would safeguard history and heritage, keeping vital family and community records, educating the new generations about their local and sometimes even their family history, and sometimes acted as a library for integral theological and philosophical texts. It provided to each community a shepherd under God that was to guide the community in whatever unique or general way that was necessary. If you are a Zoomer reading this, you have likely received none of this from the church. In fact, it was probably the opposite way around, if you even had any exposure to it at all. It wouldn't have been the church exercising influence over you and the rest of society, but rather you or your family exercising influence over it through practices like church shopping, maybe even sometimes directly telling the congregation your demands before moving on to the next church if they refuse to relent. This rather common practice should be alarming if you just take a step back. Hundreds of schisms occur in the modern day over petty conflicts about taste in music or delivery of a sermon, and this is a symptom of the fact that churches have completely lost power over society at large. In its place, educators and state officials have tried to fill the vacuum, essentially creating a secular religion. This has been excellent insofar as it secures their power almost totally, but it does not replace everything that has been destroyed and forgotten. There is no social regulation, no ideal relationship between husband and wife or between parent and child, but rather a soft manipulation to steer everyone away from the rightful path into whatever else they want to pick from. I do not need to tell you that this will cause a great increase in evil and bad relationships, but they will only be equivocable in that regard. A society that is predicated upon all versions of bad parenting, false marriages, elder abuse, and child predation will obviously collapse, but it will be so violent, vile, and vapid that its destruction will be entirely justified in the eyes of those that knew what was. The absence of the church and the presence of the secular religion has created this society for the Zoomers. So why did the church lose its influence over society? Many people would say it is the separation of church and state, but I would argue that it was the church being subsumed by the state. Before I do, though, I would like to propose an idea, not my own, that the separation of church and state was and is a smokescreen. In reality, what separation of church and state entails is the replacement of Christianity in favor of the secular religion. This makes all the more sense when one realizes that it was never any Orthodox Christian that advocated for such a policy. The phrase itself was coined by notable deist Thomas Jefferson, and it was his ideas surrounding state secularism that would go on to influence the Supreme Court in the modern age. But that is not the main point. Back to the idea that the state subsumed the church. This is not an original idea on my part, as I am drawing heavily from what Soren Kierkegaard saw during his lifetime. While it may be appealing on the surface to use state power to enforce the church and its customs on the population, this will just bring with it a much greater problem, specifically that it erodes faith and reverence. With the state churches, Kierkegaard observed that Christianity was reduced to a mere indicator, a status. It was something that you were just because, in his case, you were born in Denmark. It ended there. Most people, he observed, lacked faith or reverence because under the state's authority, to be a Christian did not require that. From the perspective of the state, the only requirements for being a Christian was to adhere to a few social standards derived from Christianity. This seems great to us now, doesn't it? Hold that thought, though. In the state's quest to have a Christian society, it reduced the Christianity it enforced to a superficial set of customs that existed just because it's what everyone else did. It virtually eliminated the pursuit of deeper theology for the population as it secularized the church. And we can see the conclusion of this in the present, with the state churches now being led by atheists and heathens, existing only as a political tool. At the time of Kierkegaard, though, the state becoming the church was much harder to object to, because the state focused on measures that sounded good. After all, it was merely trying to keep society aligned with Christianity. How could anyone object to this? As a result of reducing Christianity to utility adhered to by those who do not even know what Christianity or faith is, the state set us on the path that leads to where we are today. How does this apply to us, though? That was in 19th century Denmark, and we are in the 21st century West. Kierkegaard's criticisms of the Danish state church could be said about almost every mainstream Christian movement today. The Anglicans that remain probably sympathize with Kierkegaard all too well, seeing their doctrine obliterated at the hands of a hostile, cancerous state. In the United States, we did not have one particular denomination that was subsumed by the state, but rather it was the very concept of Christianity that was abused. For those of you that know the ideas of the Founding Fathers, they envisioned a secular government that relied on a heavily Christian population, at least insofar as they acted like Christians. This results in the exact same problem as the Danish state church. It is reducing Christianity to a mere utility. The founders enacted policies that would enshrine the utility that Christianity brought, but in doing so, they propagated only that, leaving out faith and reverence. It is certainly true that congregations and denominations have kept the faith the entire time, but the vast majority of people, in a way similar to what Kierkegaard observed, lost their faith and defaulted to just practicing dead rituals. This happened by keeping Christian practices in law, but neglecting entirely the underlying foundation, keeping illegal divorce, polygamy, sodomy, pornography, and a myriad of other abominations while neglecting faith. Here in the United States, in a way not too dissimilar from Europe, Christianity was done away with by the state whenever it lost its utility. The Supreme Court banned organized prayer in public schools and clamped down on church influence over them, making education a secular matter instead of a religious one. The affirmation abominations were legalized in the name of love, a dark perversion of actual Christian love. The legislature pushed through a torrent of laws regulating charity, while massively increasing welfare expenditure. There are many more examples, but I think the point has been made. The state has subsumed the church for most people, and the ones that have rejected this are a small minority. Another group of people to mention are the parents of the West. Once upon a time, a Western family would consist of a father who provided for the family, defended them, and led them, a mother who ensured that the home was in order and that the children were cared for in terms of material and affection, and multiple children that were brought up in the faith, being taught to honor their father and mother and how to pray. Both parents would ensure that the children knew the basics of Christianity while ensuring that they were brought up in the church. The children would also be in close proximity to the rest of their family, depending on the region and culture. Denmark, England, and the Lowlands saw the development of the nuclear family in particular, but this nuclear family was much more different than the supposed nuclear family that we see today. It has slowly been redefined, originally meaning that all children would move out and start their own family nearby their parents, whereas in the modern day it has come to mean a complete atomization of the family. Children are routinely thrown out as soon as they become a legal adult, a process which they will in all likelihood force their children to undergo as well. In doing this, they lose any deeper relationship with their family, and who wouldn't be resentful? This is a complete dereliction of the parental duties that have been handed down to us from God and an utter disregard for for the morality that both shaped and developed out of the West. It also has the added effect of viewing children as burdens and liabilities instead of blessings, an inversion of the words spoken to us from God, and an inversion of natural reality. Parents once had the responsibility of either educating or assisting in the education of their children, an activity that has been entirely outsourced and forgotten today. It is this specific abdication that has led to the modern schools becoming as they are. Parents sent their children off to the public schools, and regardless of the original intention, the motivation soon turned to lazy apathy and a form of greed. Lazy, because some of the parents of the modern age could at the very least try to counter the terrible influence of the public schools on their children by supplementing or reteaching subjects, but don't. Apathy, because some parents simply don't care about education quality or don't see anything wrong with the current state of schools. And, perhaps at first most confusing, greed. Whereas parents in the past correctly viewed their children as inheritors of the earth and continuations of their family, thus requiring quality skills, the modern parents now see their own time as more important than preparing and educating their children for the future. This is folly. The devotion afforded to modern luxury is going to be its unraveling, as the next generations, when faced with maintaining the modern world and all of its intricacies, will not have the necessary knowledge that should have been passed down to them. There might be some of them that make great engineers and doctors, sure, but few that understand the duties of parenting, if they even get that far, and fewer still that will pass on any complex ideas not pertaining to their field of work. Keep in mind, too, that as discussed in earlier videos, even the complex ideas relating to specific fields of work are themselves becoming diluted, with their education standards continually slackening. This means, in the long term, if things continue as they are, complex ideas will more and more be relegated to books that only sit to collect dust in libraries that are unwanted and unknown. This simple trend alone will destroy a civilization. They will also lack any of their civilization's stories, never having heard their own tales and mythologies, their family history, their inherited works of literature, or the actions of the great men that preceded them. So what can we, mere individuals and families, do to fix this? On the macro scale, there are little if any actions that can be done to reverse any of this, but that is because the macro scale is not impacted by individual action, but rather the summation of all individual actions. This makes it a useless lens for any of us to base our actions and strategies around, except to see if anything is improving or getting worse. Instead, you must have a family, knowing that children are a blessing, and you must ensure that your family is cared for, educated, and prepared for the coming times of hardship and ignorance. If you are adamant that you cannot educate your children on your own, that you must send them to be educated by a system that despises you, then you must see to it that your children's education is continually checked. You must set straight any falsehoods and propaganda that they are taught, and, perhaps more importantly, you must educate them in fields that they will otherwise never know. If not for you, it is entirely possible that they will never know God, know how to pray, know how to see the world outside of material, or know the true nature of humanity. You must also make sure that you pass down to your children something that will allow them to be independent from the world, be it land or some other form of property or money that can eventually be turned into either. Most importantly, pray for faith and teach your children about it. It was a rejection of God and a lack of faith that got us here in the first place. Learn the reverence that comes along with it and ensure that your children know too. Find a church that preaches and centers itself around the pure word of God, so as not to fall into the mere culture of Christianity. Remember, it was the church that guided people in a moral direction, and although it has been beaten up and broken down, it can still and should do so for you and your family. Finally, learn for yourself and pass down the stories that should have been given to you. A civilization cannot exist without its own stories and histories. These are lofty standards, but anything at all in their direction will be an improvement over the current state of the world. If we do not move in that direction, though, I do not see how this civilization will remain standing in but a few generations.